Well, tonight it's Wednesday, so that means it's all about the law. So just imagine President Obama becoming a Supreme Court justice, not Mark Stifel. Hillary Clinton says she'd be open to appointing him if she wins the White House. Again, Mark Stifel. But would that be a tough transition for the leader of the free world? Then, turnabout fair play. Grand jury looking into whether Planned Parenthood broke any laws. They wound up indicting the people who accused the group and secretly recorded them. We'll ask our panel of attorneys whether they've ever seen anything like this before. Also, the trial has started for the officer charged with killing a Kai Gurley in a Brooklyn stairwell. The shooting, clearly a mistake. But when does a mistake become a crime? Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thank you so much for joining us this Wednesday evening. And we're going to start tonight with the Supreme Court. The next president will likely have to nominate a couple of justices. At a town hall in Iowa yesterday, someone asked Hillary Clinton whether or not she would appoint Barack Obama to the highest court of the land if she won. Here's her response.
Wow, what a great idea. Nobody has ever suggested that to me. Wow. I love that. Wow. He may have a few other things to do, but I'll tell you, that's a great idea.
Now, before you say, all right, maybe she was humoring somebody with a question, there is precedent for this. William Howard Taft, he was president from 1908 through 1912. Then in 1921, President Warren Harding appointed Taft to the Supreme Court as its Chief Justice. Now, who knows whether President Obama would even be interested, but today I spoke with someone who was actually offered a job on the bench and turned it down. Now, I'm talking about Senator George Mitchell. Mitchell, senator from Maine, Democrat, majority leader for 6 years, also turned down Bill Clinton when the then president wanted to put him on the Supreme Court. And earlier today, I asked him why and also if he had any regrets. You turned down a Supreme Court nomination. Obviously, that case followed. If you assumingly had been confirmed, it would have been on the high court. Any regrets ever not taking that post, especially given some of the seismic cases that have come before it since?
On occasion, yes. Not often. I did feel that way when I read the Citizens United case. I hope everyone listening will try to read it. It's illogical. It paints a fairy tale picture of what American politics is like. It's nothing. It's really simply ridiculous in the assertions that it makes. And I wish I'd been there to argue against it, but overall not. Just think, if I had gone on the court, I wouldn't have gotten to go to Ireland, and I wouldn't be the Grand Marshal of the St. Patrick's Day Parade in a couple of weeks. So there are benefits the other way as well.
Well, tomorrow we'll be playing much more of that conversation. Fascinating on so many subjects, including the political discourse that we see now here, let alone a look around the world, if you will. Again, that's the conversation we'll get into tomorrow. Okay, but to tonight. And specifically, I want to bring our legal panel and we'll first start with Barack Obama and the premise about him on the high court. Jimmy Kasuris is a criminal defense attorney in Manhattan, sitting on the board of directors of the New York City Criminal Bar Association, frequently lecturing at New York Law School and the bar associations in Queens and New York City. Doug Von Nuys, founding partner of Carson Von Nuys, focusing on corporate misconduct and selected by the Legal 500 as one of the most influential trial lawyers in the country. Mayo Bartlett, an attorney at the law offices of Mayo Bartlett PLLC and a former chief of the Bias Crimes Unit at the Westchester County DA's office. And you've seen him in a lot of high-profile civil rights cases. In fact, we'll be talking about one coming up soon enough. Mark Furnish, professor of Brooklyn Law, arguing before the U.S. Supreme Court and arguing with just about everybody over everything. Okay, I know what he's going to say, but so before I even get to him, Jimmy, a lot of people think that if there was ever a job designed for this president, former Harvard Law Review and all the rest, the discourse at the high court and the big decisions, it would be tailor-made for a person, regardless of your political beliefs, for this sitting president. What do you think about the idea of it? And how about some of the practical considerations of how many things he'd have to recuse himself if he went there soon after leaving the Oval Office?
Well, interestingly, I think you're right that if you just look objectively at his qualifications, you might say yes. although he's never been a judge before. I don't know.
You think that's a little bit of a problem?
You
that
think
he has
just a
no
little bit?
judicial
Yeah,
experience?
Well,
you know,
again, we've seen politicians go on the high court, not just presidents.
It's true.
Earl Warren was one of them, but it's a different world now.
But
I don't know.
But the issue of Supreme Court appointments, at least in my lifetime, and increasingly so in the past few years, has become so immensely politicized that I actually think it would be a problem, given
He's
the
never
fact
gonna
that
get
he was the
confirmed.
president.
It
Right.
would never
Given
happen.
that he was the president, and the way the appointments go, and what his ideologies are, and really the direct conflicts, it almost appears, that he's had with the Supreme Court in terms of many of the decisions
Like calling
that were
them
made.
out in the State of the Union
Like
address.
calling them
that
out in the
showed a
State
lot
of Union
respect
address.
for the
So,
third branch.
you know, I think Mark is right. Confirmation would be very difficult, and you know, I don't really. I have doubts about its appropriateness.
Listen, everybody at their heart has political dispositions. Obviously, if you're the leader of the free world, yours are going to be very public and very known. But I will tell you, an element of real world that goes to the high court, in my estimation, who understands how the political process works, who understands what's practical or not, what can or can't be done, and the temperament, Republican and Democrat alike, to me, I think would be invaluable. And somebody, for example, and I'll talk about this tomorrow, George Mitchell, he was voted by his colleagues 6 straight years as the most trusted person in Washington because he could work across the aisle, even if he disagreed with the other side. I think that would be a good thing. And it's also like, this isn't
he's shown-
Sheriff
but-
Arpaio here or something. He was certainly Harvard Law, editor, you know. I don't
He
think...
has no qualifications to be on the Supreme Court. What he was an adjunct lecturer at a fine law school, the University of Chicago Law School. But I'm an adjunct lecturer at a lesser law school.
You'd be a fine judge.
You would be a fine
I-
judge.
But
I
actually,
confirm you now.
I've actually litigated, you know, in the over 100 appellate cases. He has no judicial experience. He has no litigation experience. And now, to your point, certainly in the past there were non-judicial appointees, but that is rara avis now. The way it's become a professional judiciary, and it's virtually de rigueur to have prior federal appellate judicial experience, unless you're Kagan.
Why don't you
who
make
was
my
the
point?
SG. No,
But
he
aren't you
doesn't
making my
have it.
point that you don't have to, in effect, have a career?
Now you do.
You're right.
Back then you didn't. Now everybody who gets, except Kagan, who was the SG, everyone has been.
Well,
a
don't you
former
think
federal
a
appellate
healthy
judge.
mix would be a good
But
thing?
he hasn't shown any ability at consensus building in Washington. At least Mitchell had quasi-judicial
I don't care
experience.
if you came down and you split and you're literally part of the Red Sea. Nobody. I defy Republican and Democrat, the next president's going to have consensus
They
in
talked
Washington.
about Hillary Rodham Clinton for the Supreme Court. You remember this 5 years ago. They talked about the same thing. They talk about it for everybody.
Well, Richard, to your point, I think that you look, and there's not a lot of consensus building in the court right now. If you look at Scalia in particular, he doesn't necessarily go to the other side of the aisle very often. There's absolutely nothing that would be a bar for him to be Supreme Court Justice. My bigger question would be, would it make sense? And when you start to look at any president who has 8 years under their belt, and you look at some of the decisions that were made, and arguably some of the executive decisions run afoul of the Constitution, now you put
think?
that person in a position, whether it's Barack Obama, Ronald Reagan, President Bush, or President Clinton, where you start to say that there are certain actions that are taken as executive orders that could be unconstitutional.
But don't you think that that would be helpful, Doug, in the dialogue when you're sitting in there and you're trying to find out, for example, figure out the limits of executive power?
He doesn't think there are limits.
Oh,
He
okay,
said
listen.
that already.
But you're 1 of 9. You're not 8 of 9. So that discourse in there, or about the debate about when it comes to national security, the limits of privacy, and certainly, I think that would be a fascinating dialogue when you close it and you're in the cloakroom and you're trying to figure out, you know, where's right, wrong, the line that you'll cross or you won't cross.
But theoretically, it would be helpful. But in reality, he's a guy who spent 8 years being the guy. I mean, he's almost a symbol of what the last 8 years have been. You can't
So
think
you
of a
can't
more
be
polarizing
the biggest,
person to sit on the.
You can't sit at the top of the heap and then become 1 of 9.
I mean, I think he's probably a very talented guy. They probably can do many things, but it'd be difficult for
Secretary
anybody
General of
to
the
do that.
UN, that's where he's going. I mean, this is the perfect vehicle for him to push his agenda, right? The anti-Western agenda, the anti-Israeli agenda.
Oh, my God.
The
What have I opened up
pro-Islamist
here?
agenda. He can do that without any pretense of
For
objectivity.
anyone out there who
as
thinks I'm letting Mark
Secretary
go in
General
it,
of the
if I engage, we just go on
Perfect job
forever.
for him.
Oh,
Grand
my
symbolic
God.
gestures that are meaningless. exists in the real world. Perfect.
Gargamel, you're closest. No, but imagine how much, to your end, Scalia would love to have him in the room and start opining in him as we're doing. But by the way, before you tell me about
Roberts
the
has
learned
built
jurist,
consensus.
exactly.
Roberts has built consensus. Scalia was bandied about as potential chief before Roberts, but Scalia, for all the heat and light that comes out of him, he hasn't been able to sway people ideologically to his side on the court.
And
his
how
is a
about
distinctly
Thomas, right?
minority view.
Don't you think somebody on the bench that could bring a little bit of more recent real world experience, that can understand the globe we live in, because the world has gotten a lot smaller than the court was 100 years ago?
Barack Obama's living in a world, all right, but I don't think it's the real world. I think it's his own world.
Some of the
I
best-
don't
I
necessarily
think
that he would be-
Justice Furnish is injecting his political
Rich,
ideology.
No, I just
you
don't think
also-
he's
you also
competent to
have
be on the court.
You also have to remember that the public perception and confidence in the court system is important. And you know, if what you really think is that you're going to have a situation where they're just going to be fighting in that room where you're one of 9, in the same way that they were fighting when he was the guy trying to either convince them to go one way or the other, or challenging them,
Right.
I don't know that the
But
public
remember
perception
Mario
would
Cuomo,
be
and I
good.
remember at the time, then President Kennedy, whether it was formally offered, hinted at, declined before it was offered, or actually, who'll never know. But he was another man that was seriously discussed for that. And I always thought he was built more for that than even as governor, let alone for president. And I think certain people have dispositions. They take the law very seriously. I believe, unlike you, that there are certain, for example, Tom Keane, Sr., okay? Whether I agree or not, I believe that he would put country first, okay? And Lee Hamilton also, the two guys in the 9/11 Commission. To me, there are certain people, George Mitchell's another one, that would listen, consider it, and even if it wasn't in their personal interest, if they believed that it comported with the law and was in the national best interest, I think they do these
I'm
things.
not saying that Obama wouldn't do that.
The Supreme Court is supposed to be apolitical. And in
But it's
fact,
not.
well, it's supposed
Well,
to be.
it's
But
not.
when you stop and you look at it, quite often our justices are very different than what we think they're going to be. We've had justices who were actual members of the
Well,
Ku Klux
Souter
Klan
was one
who
of
went
the-
on
the
and
great
advanced civil
disappointments.
rights for black people. We've also had justices that we thought were going to be liberal voices that turned out not to be. And quite often, some of the great judges don't have litigation backgrounds. In fact, our chief judge in the state of New York now, Janet DiFiore, does not have a tremendous litigation background.
Nope.
Well, that was when Jenny Rivera got nominated on the High Court of New York, the Court of Appeals. She came from academia, and previous to that, it was strictly the paper trail. And to Jimmy's point, when we started this, the confirmation process has become so politicized that the importance of a paper record on both sides of the aisle is now paramount. And since he has no paper record, it would be very, very difficult to nominate a person like that.
Oh, but I
in
do-
20
I'll make
seconds.
the point.
No, a judicial paper record. They want to be able to vet the prior decisions
No, people want
and
to
see
know.
what
Listen,
it looks like.
I defer, except at the end of the day, they're not just looking and trying to read the holdings and what the rationale was behind it. They want to find out if somebody's pro-choice,
Well, there's
if they're
a litmus
pro-life,
test, but
if they're
the paper
pro-
trail tells you
that's
what the
completely
litmus
it.
test
You
is.
know at least where this person stands right away. There's no divining it. He had to campaign twice to be the president of the United States. Every position, you know where he stands on it one way or the other.
No, but the
question
position is
whether or
different
not
from the law. I mean,
it probably ain't
well,
going to happen anyway.
Well, she has to get nominated before she thinks about nominating other people, so that might
That's
be
for another night, Burnish. All right. We want to get you involved in the conversation, and head over to Facebook and Twitter. I'm really curious where you folks will come down on this. Do you think President Obama would make a good Supreme Court justice?
What about UN?
I'm not letting you hijack it. All right. Akai Gurley, a name many of you may remember from a year ago, but he was shot and killed by a cop in a Brooklyn stairwell. The facts of the shooting really aren't in dispute, but things got a lot more complicated when you look at what the officer did immediately after the shooting. Now, if we all agree it was a mistake, when does a mistake become a crime here? We'll explore this hot button case after the break.